Welcome to our ACE Budget Revision Workshop. We thank you for taking some time out of your Thursday to join us. I think you'll find this information really helpful as you're preparing your new budget revisions. So as we go throughout today, we are going to be talking about breaking down your budget and really looking at all those pieces and parts. Then we'll get into how to develop your own budget revision, a few fiscal basics, and then like I said, we do have some time set aside for Q&A. We do have in the slide deck a more comprehensive agenda, particularly for when you receive the slides after this, because we will be sending out the PDF of the slide deck like we have previously. And this way you'll have a nice detailed agenda of the things that we're going to cover in each of the categories today. So I'm Sarah Brightwell with the OIE Technical Assistance Team, and with us today presenting we have Bianca Williams, your ACE Program Officer. And then we also have Colin Bishop from the Office of General Counsel. So you'll be hearing from each of them as we go throughout our time together today. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Bianca to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our budget revision workshop. I hope this is useful to you all. We know that the budget we're requesting from you is a little complex, so please use this time if you have any questions. We do have our program attorneys on the phone that can help me clarify anything, but I am your program officer, so I will be working with you for the remainder of this award. So if there's any questions or concerns you have, now is a great time to ask them in the chat box. But we probably have it covered in the slides as well too, so you might want to hold those questions. Next slide. So it's really important to know exactly how much money you were awarded. So one key thing to remember is that we award grants per year. So on your GAN, you will always see the action amount, which should be the same as the budget period. The budget period will be your first year's budget. And then your performance period will be the whole grant itself. So if you applied for 5 years, it'll be your 5 years. If you only applied for 4 years, it'll be your 4 years. But one key thing as well too with your budget period, which you were awarded this year, if you requested a planning period, that planning period is a part of your first year funds if it's less than 12 months. So if you are only requested a planning period for 6 months, your 6-month planning period, along with those 6 months that you're actually implementing services, will be combined in the same budget period. They are not separated. Next slide. So this is a beautiful umbrella to show you how the ACE budget category structure is. We are very familiar with the standard budget categories that kind of look like the raindrops underneath the umbrella. But in the umbrella for ACE, we need to have direct admin, which is 5%, your ACE constructional costs, which has a max of 15%, any project supervision and contract supervision that's needed for this grant is a part of the umbrella, as well as your indirect costs, and of course, the direct services that will be going to students. Next slide. So for those in the planning period, the only limitation that you need to be mindful of is the 5% that's spent on direct admin costs. All the other budget requirements, like the 15% max for your selection method, that does not start until you're actually implementing. So the only thing that you need to worry about right now in your planning period is that 5% direct admin cost. And direct admin costs, again, would be attending meetings like this, reporting your APR, any direct communication that you're having with your program officer on the federal side to administer your grant. Next slide. For those in implementation, so if you did not plan to have a planning period, or if you only have a 3-month planning period, during that implementation period where you are actually serving students, 80% of your total funds must go to those students. So they have to be direct service costs, and the funds that students can use to choose the educational services that you will be providing. No more than 20% of those funds are allowed to go to the project costs. And that includes everything else that's not direct services to the student. So your service selection method, any family feedback method you'll have, any indirect costs that you would like to charge, and that direct admin costs that you'll be charging to complete reports and communicate with me. Next slide. So I know, if you had any of the pre-application webinars, you've seen this pyramid before. This kind of just shows the representation of how you will be spending these funds when you are implementing services. The majority of the funds must go to students. So this is very different than any previous funding like NYCP or other grant funds where it might not have that big of an amount that's directly for services. But the direct services includes like the per pupil cost for students and any other costs in the contracts. That includes like travel and supplies for those services that the students will be selecting. I know we'll be breaking this out a little bit more in slides, but for the ACE project costs, again, that includes the structural costs. So that means how your students will be selecting services, parent feedbacks, how are you getting some of your GIPR data measures, as well as any feedback from parents to request services, and your direct admin costs, again, that means any costs that it will take to complete reports, and to communicate with me, to be on, the webinars that we provide, et cetera. All your indirect costs would have to still be included in that 20%, and all other project supervision costs. So any overseeing of the contracts and direct services to students would be included in that 20% cap. Next slide. So we know that a lot of grantees will be offering services as well as one of the service providers. So we thought it was important to point out that you are able to provide services, but it's also in the regs that you must have multiple service providers. So you cannot be the only service provider. So the time and any selection that's made of the service that you're offering will be included in that 80% budget to direct services. We do know that this is, a little different and complex because we have it broken out as 80%. So like any personnel that you may hire to provide services, we definitely want that to be separated from personnel that's overseeing the grant. Sometimes this is easier if you create like a contract with our agreement kind of with your service providers or personnel, or if they need to be on actual payroll. We are going to walk through the budget worksheet in a little bit to show you how you can separate those costs. But it is possible to provide services as long as you have additional service providers and options that students can choose from. Next slide. So these are the ACE project costs. Again, the ACE project costs equal that 20% that you're allowed to have in your budget during the implementation years. So we do know that the max amounts of each of these available will be more than 20%. So, it is up to you to determine how much you can use on each of these costs. Of course, you cannot use the max in each category. But, for some things like maybe your parent feedback process, if you are doing like a Survey Monkey or something, you might not need 15% of the costs. If the service selection method is just, selecting services on a piece of paper or on a website or something that's already ran by the tribe or your organization, where that cost is not going to be a lot, then you have more funds to spend, on that other supervision or indirect costs. So you do have to weigh out how you want to spend that 20%. We do know that a lot of organizations have higher indirect costs, that they may not be able to apply their full indirect costs because of these limitations. So, if you are having any troubles with figuring out how you can sort these different costs to fit into that 20% cap, then please, we can, kind of talk one-on-one. Every single grantee and program is completely different. So I know, a lot of my answers cannot really fit all. And yeah, a lot of grantees are in their planning period now to kind of figure out how they can collect some of this information. If you're actually hiring a parent liaison, or if you're going to have a Facebook community network or something, there's so many different ways that you can get at having all of these ACE project costs, but different costs. So you can have an extravagant app that collects all the information and provides the services that you're offering, or you can add it on to something that your indirect costs can charge to. So there's so many different ways to get at this. If you are having troubles, we might have some time to reflect some ways to do things or answer questions at the end of this presentation. But again, reach out to me as soon as you can so we can work through some of those dilemmas or questions that you do have. Next slide. So annual cost per student. So this was a big part of determining your budget, was, the per pupil costs for students. So every grantee must set that per pupil cost per service. That's something that included in your agreements and your contracts with the service providers, is exactly how much it's going to cost for that student. So if that student is, let's say, going to a STEM camp in the summer, something they select, and that camp costs $200 per year during the summertime. So that per pupil cost for that STEM camp would be $200. So you need to make sure that's determined upfront in your agreements, that the cost per student is agreed upon, and then that service provider will be paid depending on how many students actually select that service. So something else that we would have you guys decide is how to really allocate the quantity of services for each student. So an example could be, you can have a maximum amount per student. So say each student, you allocated completely $2,000 per student, or this example, I'm sorry, gives $250 per student. So each family can select off of a menu of services for anything up to $250. Now, some services might cost $250, while 3 services might add up to $250. So that would be up to the family to determine how they would want to spend that cost. And again, this is just an example. Or if your budget allows as well, you can have an example where each family can select up to a set number of total services. So if you know that all your services equal, about the same amount of money, you can say each child can have 3 services that might still equal up to that $250. So you do need to determine, how the funds will be spent if you don't have to force kids to participate in services, but if there are, more interest in one service than another, we can submit budget revisions to make sure that our students can get that service as well. Next slide. So unallowable expenses. I want to make it really clear how different this funding is compared to maybe typical funding that you had from Department of Ed or even demonstration before if you're a previous NYCP grantee. With 80% of the funding going to students as direct services, as well as those services having to be selected by the student, then, there's a lot of things that we cannot charge to this grant like you may have before for other grants. So a big one is like professional development for service providers. We cannot allow professional development. Ideally, no student will ever select a service where they're going to select, professional development for teachers rather than something that they can learn and do for themselves. Also in the regs, it was very clear that we cannot build the capacity of the service providers using this grant money. So, professional development for the service providers is not allowable. And as always, with any of the demonstration funds before, we cannot give money directly to families or gift cards. So that per pupil amount, we're not just saying, here's your $250, choose your summer program as you wish. We have to make sure that the funds are going directly to the service providers, and gift cards and money of any sort, even if it's for transportation or for incentives, or anything that you can think of is not allowable. And entertainment, of course, we cannot use federal funds for entertainment purposes. So, please don't plan to take all the students to an end of the school year amusement park or movie or something like that because they completed the program, because that is not allowable. Next slide. Okay, so I know I've been talking for a little bit, and before we turn it over to Sarah about the budget revision, I think we can see if there's any questions.
We do have a couple, just for those who put them in the box. If they were about indirect cost rate, we're going to hold those because we have an indirect cost rate section in a minute, but we do have a couple of programmatic questions. So one of them being, are group services allowed where several students or after school students want to learn a language? So can they offer it in a group setting?
And the answer to that is yes. You can have a class that's a group. I think what Bianca was just talking about is that it's still important to figure out a per pupil cost or a per student cost for that.
Perfect. So yeah, so
yes,
they can offer it in a group setting, but you would still need to know how much it costs per individual child. The other question here is, so how will grantees know if their budget areas were calculated wrong based on their interpretation of what was submitted? So basically, how will they know if what they submitted was incorrect?
So I can answer that, Colin. We did not have an application requirement for you to break out the budget. We do have a program requirement that requires the budget to be broken out. So that's, partially our fault for not including an application requirement that required you to submit your budget, how we're asking you to do it now. And all of the standard forms, the 524B form that's filled out for the budget, that has just standard categories for it. So it does not separate, the cost how we would like it. I believe that there was like one or two grantees that actually submitted a separate budget or broke out their budget to identify which costs would be considered a constructional cost direct costs and direct services cost as well. So there are one or two grantees that submitted a budget that's completely fine, that, you know, have those components that we've talked about. But for the majority of the grantees that submitted their budget, we did not ask this before, we're asking it now. So it's most likely that it was not submitted in this format.
All right, and the next one was just clarifying. So incentive payments for participation are unallowable.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. And do professional development restrictions apply to the staff who are administering the grant?
So that's a tricky one. I'm sorry, Bianca.
Go ahead, take it. I'm happy you'll take it.
So what the regulations say is that grantees cannot use grant funds to build the capacity of the service providers, because the idea is that the service provider is probably, not necessarily, probably a separate organization that is getting paid for each student that it is providing a service to. And so that's what the grant funds are supposed to pay for. There shouldn't be another stream of money coming from the grantee to the service providers for professional development or for professional development. The idea is that you're paying the service providers for the service that they're providing. That's what the grant funds are really supposed to be for. If you want to use grant money, if the grantee wants to use grant money to pay for professional development for the grantee itself, that's fine, as long as that expenditure fits within the overall cap that 20% of your budget be used for these sort of ACE project costs, and that 80% goes to student services in the implementation years. In a year where it's a planning period and there isn't that requirement for 80% spent on direct services to students, then you would be able to spend, it would be easier to spend grant money on professional development for the grantee itself, because those caps aren't there.
Great. Now I'm going to pop back a slide because we have a couple questions about the per student cost. So I'll just pop up that slide for reference as we're answering these. So the first question is, their understanding is that they need to set a total award amount or credit amount per student that's eligible to make sure that it's equitable across all programming. Or is it not enough to just list the total per student cost by program?
So when we talk about per pupil cost, what needs to be determined is the per pupil cost per service. So if you have, for example, let's say the service provider that you're contracting with is YMCA. So for YMCA, in your service agreement, you will say that that per pupil cost for each student to have a STEM class would be like $200. So each student that enrolls in that service would be for $200. Now it's up to you to determine how you will decide how to complete that whole budget. If you're going to limit, you know, your students to 3 services per year, or if you want to cap each student out at, like, you're going to allow each student 1,000 per year. We're not telling you to explain how much will be decide, or you should have a plan for budget purposes, you know, but we just need to know really the per pupil amount per each service. So, you know, we can't, some students might only want 1 service, so we don't want to say like each student will have, you know, $1,000. You can put a limit for your own policies, but we really just need to know, you know, the per pupil per service, if that makes sense.
I think,
And then,
I was just going to say, in addition to that, if you think about Bianca's example of like a program at the YMCA, it's important it would be important to pay the YMCA on a per student basis, some sort of per student basis, because it is possible that 0 students would sign up to participate in the program at the YMCA. So if you make an agreement with the YMCA to say, we're going to pay you $10,000 to run a program, and then no kids sign up for it, then it's putting everybody in a bad situation in terms of budget. So considering these things on some sort of per student basis, it is going to make it easier because students really do have choice in what they participate in.
All right. The other question on that same vein was, so if a student didn't use their full allowed amount, then would it be allowable for other students with need to use that leftover amount? So like if it was 1,000 and they only ended up using 700, could they put that 300 that wasn't used by student A toward another student?
So that would be a program decision, and that should be, decided in equal and fair amongst all students. So that is something that each program should determine, unless there's already a policy within your program about something similar to this. But yeah, if you do not spend the funds on one student and they don't want to use it, we still want you to use all of your funding. So, if it's up to you, if you want to, put a limit to how many the students can sign up to, and what that limit will be.
Great. And then is there a recommended limit for non-monetary or non-gift card or non-entertainment incentives for students?
Maybe we can have a talking stick session to help develop some good incentives that would not be considered, gift cards or something that's unallowable. I'm pretty sure you guys are in the field and know more than I do. So we definitely can, brainstorm together.
Yeah, so we will put that on the talking stick upcoming list. And then if they think they are one of the 2 grantees that already submitted their budget in the appropriate format, should they just reach out and double check that with you?
Yes.
Okay. Next question, what kinds of outreach are allowable or not? Do we want to get into that or add that to a talking stick?
I think probably holding that for later is a good idea.
Okay. If one of the service providers is doing a career readiness program, but it is virtual, then can they purchase computers for the service provider?
That sounds like a very fact-specific question, and will depend on how you structure your contract with your service provider. It depends on who actually owns the laptops at the end of the day. So I think we should probably talk about that one separately. But as a general matter, if you're spending grant money to build up the capacity of your service provider, of a service provider, that's not allowed. If you are bundling some costs that the service provider is going to have into what you pay that service provider for the service that they're providing, that's probably okay.
All right. So it sounds like for that person, maybe put together some details of what you're hoping to do and send those over to Bianca for review. Is the per student cost per grant year or for the whole project budget? So should they be looking at annual cost per student or project cost per student?
Annual. You are awarded on an annual basis, and also after 3 years of your grant, you will receive, we have to make sure that we are paying grantees that's making a substantial amount of effort to meet their goals. So there will be like a review. So, not every year is promised. You definitely want to make sure that you are planning pretty much everything on an annual basis.
Perfect. Just a note for people with questions. I've got the incentives, the outreach, and then the question about parent feedback for future reference. Next up is, if we have funding available for students to work with multiple service providers, are we able to move forward with this participation?
That's a program decision. How are you allocating your funds? How many students can you serve? If you have enough money to have students see multiple service providers or multiple services, that's great.
So I'm wondering if this grantor who's asking this is in a planning period as well too. So we have to make sure that while we are in a planning period that we are not providing services to students, and that there are, those 4, if not more, requirements to be turned in after the end of the planning period. So we got to make sure that we're not in a planning phase while we are still providing services.
Yeah. So Dara, I would suggest either pop more details in the chat box or send that separately to Bianca. Would overhead rental costs for tutoring meeting space, so facility rental costs for tutoring meeting space, be considered administrative or student services?
So the service provider is responsible for providing the service, which means they're going to have the people who are doing it, the place to do it, the supplies to do it, etc. And so all of those the payment from the grantee to the service provider should be high enough that it allows the service provider to provide for all of the things that they need to run their service, in this case, a tutoring program. The grantee should not be separately paying for office space for the service provider. The grantee can pay for office space for themselves out of that 20% ACE project cost, but for services to students, that cost any cost that the service provider incurs in delivering that service should be considered when they're deciding how much to charge for that service.
Great. All right, so we are going to go to the next piece because that kind of answers some of the next questions. So questions about if there's going to be a template provided. We do have a tool that we're about to talk about, and then about percentages. So we will come back to those because I think they'll get covered in this next chunk. All right, so we are going to actually talk about going ahead and setting up your budget revision. So we have put together an optional budget revision tool that you can use for doing this. Now it is optional, so if you are one of the folks who already had your budget in this setup, you're welcome to use your existing format, or if you have another way to present this same information, you're welcome to do that. But this is the information that you'll be expected to provide for your budget revision. So you may find it simpler to use the tool. So let's go in and look at what that looks like. And we'll actually go into the spreadsheet so you can see kind of how it works. But the very first piece of the spreadsheet is looking at that per student cost that we were just talking about. So you would input your information in those pink colored cells. And you'll know that you've at least entered information because they will turn back blue. So you'll enter your organization name, whatever your grant is under, your PR award number, your project director name. Remember, that's your project director on your GAN. If that information is incorrect, you need to reach out to Bianca to change that. Your phone number and email, and your approved indirect cost rate. Remember that if you have a new indirect cost rate, you're going to need to also then submit with your budget revision any documentation of that new indirect cost rate since your proposal. You've already got here the space for your implementation date. So if you have a planning period, if you're someone who has a few months of planning or a full year, you'll enter your planning period in this first cell, and the next one for your implementation period. For those of you who are already implementing and you went straight into implementation, put in the full year and just leave that planning period blank. That's fine. And then you'll enter in your full budgets. So whatever your budget is for your planning period, if that's applicable, for your first year's implementation period, again, whether that be a full or partial year, and then your full year amounts for years 2 through 5. When you're setting up your pieces and parts here, you're going to enter any of the providers who are going to provide services to your students, including yourself. If you as a grantee are providing services, you'll enter yourself here as well, because basically you're listing every service option that you're going to provide to students. So that full menu of options that you're going to provide to students will be entered here. You'll put the provider name, the service that they'll be providing, who are the targeted students. So if you have a service that's only for kinder through 5th grade students, or it's only for high school students, whatever that target group of students that service is for, that annual cost per student. So how much will that service cost per student per year? Approximately how many students you think are going to take advantage of that particular service. And you'll notice this final column isn't pink, and that's because it's going to automatically calculate for you. So you'll notice there are a lot of things in the spreadsheet that will automatically calculate for you, just to help cut down on mathematical errors. I don't know about you, but it's very likely that when working with this many numbers and this many different pieces and parts, it's easy to make a mathematical error. So we've tried to include as many formulas as possible to take that dilemma out for you. So it will automatically calculate the grand total that you estimate to spend on that particular service. Okay, so this is your first tab. Then you have a second tab for planning period. Again, if you do not have a planning period, if you're going directly into implementation, you'll just skip this tab. And then you have tabs, you have 5 tabs for implementation periods for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5, because you are completing a budget revision for your entire project period. Okay, so not just for this year, for your entire project period. So all of those are already within that spreadsheet. So I think it'll make a lot more sense and give you a better idea of how it works if we go directly into the tool. So I'm going to switch our screen so you can actually see an example and how you'll actually go about completing this particular tool if you choose to use it. So let me switch this for you. Okay. All right. And can y'all give me a thumbs up if you can see? Oh, see, it stopped the screen. I was like, I don't think that's quite working correctly. Let's try this again. All right. Thumbs up if you can see a spreadsheet. Awesome. Thank you. The perk of having some folks on camera with me today. Thank you. All right. So we are going to look at this little example, and we'll start on that per student cost tab. So you'll see I've entered my imaginary provider. They're providing counseling services for my kinder to 8th grade students at an annual cost of $350. I estimate that about 90 students are going to take part in that. So that means that it's going to cost me approximately $31,500, and it automatically calculated that. You'll notice, if I needed to enter another provider, it turns blue as I enter it, because it's just letting you know which cells you're able to enter information in and which are locked because they have formulas or set information in them. So you'll just go through, that one's a pretty easy tab. We'll go over to planning period. You'll notice that all of your information, your grantee name, PR award number, project director, planning period dates, your award amount, and your indirect cost rate will automatically pre-populate based off of what you entered on this first page. So that way you're not spending a bunch of time retyping information. It'll do it for you. All right, so as we look in here, this first blue column is your budget as you had it in your grant proposal. So when you look back into your application at that original budget that you submitted, that's what's going to be placed here, okay? So you're just taking it directly from there. You're putting it into those standard cost categories. So if you had a project director, then you'll put them in and how much you had allocated for them. Now you'll see, if I take this out of here, same thing, you can put information into any of those pink cells, and no matter what I put here, it will automatically calculate my total for personnel. So it's going to take care of that. So you're just entering your line items anywhere in any of these columns. Once you've done that, it will total. So you want to make sure that that total matches the total from your original grant application. And then we'll go over to this green area, which is what you're changing your budget to, your requested revised budget. That's where we get into all these pieces and parts that we've been talking about today. So you have your direct administrative budget. Remember, in either your planning or implementation year, it cannot exceed 5%. Now, if yours is only 3%, that's fine. It just can't exceed 5%. For a planning year, there are no particular restrictions on your structural, so your service selection and family feedback or your other project supervision. And your indirect is, of course, always limited by your indirect cost rate. Now, you'll see here, this area with percentages, and it says your current percentage. That's just showing you, as you're doing all of your budgeting, where you are currently. So you can keep looking and seeing, okay, well, I'm at 4.65%, I'm still okay. But one other feature that's in here, and I'll put in a really high amount to show you. If I exceed 5%, you'll notice it turns yellow to warn you. It's not going to take out what you put in. You could still submit this, but you know if there's anything yellow on here, it's getting sent back to you. Bianca's just going to turn around and send it back home to you because it's got an error. So it just gives you a little kind of visual clue like, oh no, I've done something that's going to get it sent back. Okay, and it'll do that with any of them that have a limit. So your direct administrative and your indirect for your planning year. You'll see it's going to go ahead and still continue to tally up across the way. And then you have this budget revision explanation. So when we get to the budget revision explanation, you're only going to be entering something here if you're making a change. Okay. So yes, you're changing in that you're splitting things out the way that OIE needs you to have them split out. But you see, let's see here, travel for PD meeting. If you had budgeted 5,000 and now you know that it's a virtual meeting, you're not going to have any travel. So now in my new budget, you see that I've budgeted nothing. Okay, then that means that I'm going to need to put in an explanation. So something like PD meeting virtual, no travel needed. In other areas where I never budgeted anything for equipment and I still haven't, of course, I don't need to enter anything. You're only putting something in that final column if you're making a change from your proposed budget to your new budget. Okay. The other little tip, and this is just my tip to make it easier because depending upon the version of Excel you have, the easiest way to add a row, because most likely, particularly under like contractual, you're going to have many more expenses. I find the way that is kind of foolproof, no matter what version of Excel you have, is to always select the last row in that category and then insert from there. If you do that, it's always, depending upon, like mine always gives me a little message like, hey, you know, you're adding something to a spreadsheet with formulas, but it still does it. Okay, so it always works if you do the last row in that category. Sometimes if you have a different version of Excel, if you do the first one, it acts a little funky, but last one, it always behaves appropriately. Now for implementation period, you'll see it looks basically the same. The biggest differences being we have more restrictions in our implementation periods. So you'll see we still have our same 5% here for direct administrative that it's calculating, but now we have that 15% and overall that we can only spend 20. So again, if all of a sudden I pop a huge number, well, I'm gonna have to go higher. Let's see. I have to get more out of hand in my spending. Okay. So now I've definitely exceeded my 15%. So you'll see again, it's going to warn me there. The other place it's now going to start warning you because there are more restrictions is up here in your top area. So before the top area was just showing you your overall award. Now it's going to be showing you a little bit more information. So you'll see your project costs. Remember all of this can't be more than 20%. So if it exceeds 20%, again, it's going to visually remind you in yellow. And then your direct services needs to be at least 80%. So if it's not, again, it's going to visually remind you in yellow and just kind of give you a heads up that it's outside the parameters of what's allowable. And all of that will automatically calculate for you just based on what you're putting into the rows. Okay. So that's kind of a quick overview. All of your implementation periods will look exactly the same as this because they all have the same restrictions. The only difference you'll see is that it'll say year 2 or year 3 and be populated with your award information from that time. So let me switch back over. All right. And I know you may have a few questions. We're going to get to those, but I want to make sure that you have time to get all of the rest of the information as well. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Colin to talk about some of our fiscal basics.
Great. Thanks. I'm Colin Bishop. I'm from the Office of the General Counsel, here to talk about some of the more legal stuff. But I feel like you've met me at the past 3 webinars. So let's go on to the next slide. So everything we've talked about up until this point has been specific to ACE. All of this stuff about structural costs, family selection and service selection, parent feedback process, all that stuff, that has all been specific to ACE, with the one exception of the 5% limit on direct admin, which applies to, I think, pretty much all of our grant programs. But all of the slides up until now have really been about ACE. And that's important because this program is very different than other grant programs. The next few slides that I'm going to cover now are applicable to all of our grant programs. So if you've had another grant, whether it's NYCP or something else, you've heard all this stuff before, and it's the same rules that you've heard before. This section of the fiscal basics is not changing because of ACE. So let's start with what is an allowable cost. Basically, what are you allowed to spend money on? The general considerations are here on the slide, but please look at the uniform guidance in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is 2 CFR 200.403. It's all about what is an allowable cost. The things that you need to think about are, is the cost reasonable and necessary for the program? And we'll talk about reasonable and necessary in a little bit more depth in a moment. Is the expense in compliance with laws, regulations, and grant terms? So if you have a local law about how you need to spend money or what you're allowed to spend money on, please follow your state and local laws in addition to the federal laws and federal regulations here. And additionally, you need to make sure that it's in your expenses in compliance with your the terms of your grant. Additionally, you need to consider to what extent is the expense allocable to the grant, meaning is this cost for something that the grant is using or that the grant project is using, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. Next, is the cost adequately documented? If you have a cost and you don't document it, you don't have the receipts, you're breaking your policies about how you document your expenses, that's not allowable. That cost becomes unallowable. And then finally, is it consistent? Is this cost consistent with grantee rules that apply to both federally funded and non-federally funded activities? So if you have a rule about if you're, where you pay, if you pay a low rate for something when it's your own money, you can't then pay a higher rate for that same thing when it's when you're using federal money. Basically, your rules and your policies need to be applicable and need to be consistent across federally funded and non-federally funded activities. Next slide, please. So reasonable and necessary. Reasonable and necessary, please take a look at 2 CFR 200.404 for even more information about how do we define reasonable and necessary. Because like we said a moment ago, an expense is only allowable if it's reasonable and necessary to the grant purpose. So when we're thinking about that, is this thing that you want to buy or this thing that you want to spend money on generally recognized as reasonable? Are other grant projects doing this? Have we allowed this sort of thing in the past? Those are some of the considerations. Does it follow sound business practices? So if you are if you're running a business, it's probably not a good idea to spend a all of your budget on having really fancy displays in your store and zero money on like employee training and employee salaries and benefits, because then you'll have no one to sell. You'll have a very beautiful store, but you'll have no one to sell the stuff in the store. So just make sure that your expenses are following generally sound business practices. Is this cost aligned with market prices in the area? This is important, especially for grantees in this grant program, because where you are it's very different between grantees, and we have a lot of grantees who are in very rural or remote areas, and that can really affect the prices that you'll need to pay for various things necessary for your grant. Is it prudent under the circumstances? Again, this is sort of similar to the following sound business practices. You want to make sure that a cost is what you're spending money on is wise, and you're being responsible with the amount of money that you have. And then finally, consistent with grantees' policies. If you're spending money on something and doing that, you're breaking your own policies, that's not reasonable or necessary. Next slide, please. The other thing that I mentioned a couple of slides ago is that a cost is allowable if it's allocable to the grant. So for more information about what allocable means, take a look at the Uniform Guidance to CFR 200.405. But in short, allocable means that the good or the service can be assigned to an award, so your grant award, or cost objective in accordance with the relative benefit achieved. So if you're buying something using grant funds, that thing that you bought needs to be used for the grant or needs to provide a benefit to that grant. If a cost benefits two or more projects or activities or programs in proportions that can be determined without undue effort or cost, then the cost should be allocated to the projects based on the proportional benefit. So as an example, if you have a project director and your project director spends half of her time on grant A and the other half of her time on grant B, and you buy that project director a new computer for this year, and she's going to use that computer for her project director duties, you would want to allocate 50% of the cost of that computer to grant A and 50% of the cost to grant B. There was a question that was asked earlier in terms of how, hold on, let me pull it up. Oh, there was a question earlier about allocating salary, so like staff salary, to the direct admin portion of the budget. And you can, in fact, allocate a portion of the salary to direct admin. So, for example, if your project director is going to spend 5% of their time doing direct admin work, 95% of their time doing other supervision, then you want to allocate 5% of that person. You can choose to allocate 5% of that person's salary to direct admin, the other 95% of their salary to the other project supervision category. So allocable is most important when we're talking about allocating it between different grants or different funding sources, but also keep in mind that you can allocate costs within those different categories in the ACE budget. Next slide, please. If you need more information about the uniform guidance, here are the links. We call it uniform guidance all the time. The literal technical name is Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. But everyone calls it uniform guidance. There are great training resources on the Department of Education's page, which is listed there. If you want to go to the uniform guidance, just the first part, the first page of the uniform guidance, that's the link to CFR 200. If you want to skip down to the cost principles section in the uniform guidance, that's that following link right there for cost principles, which is part E. And then you might also want to check out cfo.gov. They have some great training modules where you can learn a lot about how all of these parts of the uniform guidance work. And the link for that is right there. Next slide, please. Indirect cost rate. Obviously, there's a lot of folks, maybe everybody has an indirect cost rate. One of the questions that came up was about indirect cost rates, asking about where your indirect cost rate comes from. It should be on your approved application. And the only folks that should be using a de minimis indirect cost rate are if you've never had a rate before and you're going to negotiate one now. Otherwise, you should be using the cost rate, the indirect cost rate that's on your approved application. Here are some resources about indirect cost rates. Next slide, please. Once you've checked those out, if you still don't have your answer or you have a really specific, fact-specific question, you can reach out by email to indirectcostdivision@ed.gov. And you can also give the director a call. He will probably pass you on to the appropriate person on his team to answer your question. But if you're not getting a response at that email address, you might want to reach out by phone. Next slide, please. Before I hand this off, there was one other question about indirect cost rates. For the planning year, there's a question about, there's a difference between your indirect cost rate during the planning year and indirect cost rates during your implementation years. The maximum indirect cost rate you can charge is your approved indirect cost rate. That's the maximum. There are these other caps though. So in a year where you're implementing services, you have that requirement that 80% of your budget go to direct services for students. If your indirect cost rate is 25%, well, then it's impossible to use your full indirect cost rate because you'll never spend 80% on services. You'll probably have to go, I mean, your indirect cost rate is going to get squeezed by the other things that need to fit within that 20% cost or ACE project cost during your implementation years. During a planning period, there isn't that 80% requirement for direct services, so your indirect cost rate can probably fit. You can probably use your full indirect cost rate during the planning period, but you need to have a plan for how you're going to reduce that during your implementation years, because if you don't, you might get yourself in trouble. I think that's all my slides and all the questions relevant to those slides. So I think I'm handing it back to Bianca now.
Yeah, and I think that was all the indirect cost rate questions that we had. I know we are a couple of minutes over, but we are going to take just a few final questions and wrap up. Just that final reminder that your budget revisions are due to Bianca by November 18th. You are allowed to turn them in early, just not late. So make sure to get those to her no later than November 18th. And you're going to email them to her at bianca.williams@ed.gov, which I'm sure all of you already have in your frequent sender list. And then we also have coming up. So we know that there's a lot of questions about contracts, and contracts are so important for this particular grant project, but they have lots of parts and pieces. So Office of General Counsel is working diligently to put together a wonderful tool for you for contracts that you can use. We are going to have a whole webinar on that tool and on the ins and outs of contracts on November 19th. And that will be at 2 p.m. I'll send out an invite to all of you this afternoon after this event. So look for that in your email box. If someone else invited you to this event and you are not getting those invites yourself, feel free to email us at oie@seiservices.com to get added onto that list. And then we are going to do a couple of questions, but I did want to pop up that final contact slide, reminding you to also always include your PR number when emailing OIE, as well as your program name. That's super helpful too, so that Bianca has all the information she needs to be able to give you the information that you need. So a couple of final questions here. So by offering choices to families, we might not always be offering the lowest rates based on a variety of selection. So is that understood, or should those higher outliers be left off the menu of choices for families?
So that is a project management decision, but the quality of the providers should be important. So, you have a budget that's been approved already in your application. You do want to make sure that you are providing those services that the students and families want, but that is also budgeted properly.
And I'm going to close this just so we can see each other as we wrap up these questions. The next one is, so kind of back to that thought about computers. Instead of purchasing a computer for a service provider, if computers are being purchased for the students to do virtual learning, but then the students are also going to use those computers to do activities with outside entities, will they need to be allocated across both purposes?
So it's a little confusing because I don't know what you mean by outside entities, but also, so one of the services that a grantee can provide is supplies, which technically can be computers. I don't know if any of the approved applications put, in their application that they are providing supplies, but that is one of the services. But if you are, let's say, like the student is also receiving like Title IV funds or funding from, I don't know, another federal agency, and they are using that computer, then yes, that computer will need to be allocated. Anytime that that equipment or supplies item is being used for multiple federal programs, then an allocation will need to happen.
And just to follow up a little bit more detail on what Bianca said, her example is great, where one of the things that one of the services you could provide is supplies, a computer. And you could have students choose to say, oh yes, I request one of the services I pick is getting an iPad and some school supplies. In that scenario, the school supplies, the computer, go to the student. That's why it can be counted in the 80% of direct services to students. You can't have the student pick it, but then it's owned by the service provider.
Right. Yeah, great. And that actually answered another question in the box at the same time. So perfect. And then there's one that's in there a couple of times, and I think it's really important. Do the grantees need to wait until you approve their new budget revision to start spending money and drawing down money?
No, you do not need to wait. So this budget is just to align it to get into those particular categories. This is for our information to have on file. We've made budget reductions already for some grantees if we've seen unallowable costs. So your GAN, you are able to spend the funds, but make sure that, they are allowable and applicable to your grant, as well as following the uniform guidance, and also make sure that if you are in that planning period, that it is for the planning period stuff, for building the selection method, getting your contracts, maybe doing surveying, whatever needs to be done in your planning period. And then if you are in your actual implementation, then you can implement. So I've seen a question before too. We might have answered it in the chat, but I think it's super important if you had a planning period and now you've got everything planned already, so you want to have a shorter planning period. We will definitely need to see a revised budget that would need to be approved, as well as those program requirements, like having your service selection method explain, your parent feedback method explain, those 4 criteria that you will have to have before implementing. So if you are trying to change from your planning period to your implementation period, then I would say that I would like to approve an actual approval for that. So do not start implementing services if you requested a planning period, because we do have to check off some boxes and make sure things are ready to go. But if you are staying in your planning period, make sure you're spending funds on your planning period. And if it's the implementation year, make sure, it's implementation stuff. But another question too is that, right now we know that a lot of people are in their planning period. So we do want to make sure that this is the best estimate that you have. We know a lot of contracts or services may change within this planning period, but we just want to make sure that we're all on the same path and the right mind frame on how we can spend this program funding, because it is completely different than NYCP. We want to make sure that there are contracts and service provider agreements in place, that we're not just paying for the whole service or the actual entity, that it is just paid by student that enrolls. So we are not just having a after school program that is a free for all and anyone can go. The students actually need to select that service, and so on. So we're just trying to make sure everyone's in the right mind frame for this budget, and that the budget is aligned with that program requirement of ensuring that 80% of the funds are going to students in that implementation year. So we are asking for the complete program's terms budget. So every year would need to be submitted. And then, of course, you can revise your budget as much as you need. There's not a limitation for revisions, and we'll also have, some more webinars and information for minor revisions and changes in the future. But we just want to make sure, everyone's kind of understanding the big differences and how we can spend this particular funding.
Great. I do want to give everyone a reminder. Other Sarah has popped over in the chat box the survey. So if you are needing to hop, please make sure and do that before you totally leave for the day. It takes 2 to 3 minutes and is super easy. And then just our last couple of questions. We are down to our final ones. So if they did not have an evaluator in their application, is that something that they could add through this budget revision?
I mean, you can, but that evaluator cost would be in that 20% budget and not 80%. So if you feel like you need an evaluator to help gather the data that's needed for the GIPR measures, which we do know we are collecting a lot, or maybe even if you need, maybe you might just need the evaluator in your planning period as well too, and you just need to help them collect what services you should do for students or the feedback from family. So it is up to you about the evaluator. Evaluators are not required. We are not telling you you need one. We do hope that the resources and the technical assistance we provide will help you with collecting that information. So we do not require an evaluator, but we do know, if you are serving a lot of students or you do have a bigger area, it may be very important or a needed expense to hire an evaluator, but it is not required. You can show the need for evaluator for certain situations.
Great. And could you just clarify what it means to develop the capacity of other entities? So on that restriction, as far as, I see Colin nodding, he's already on it.
Yeah, Colin, go ahead.
So here's the deal. Develop the capacity is a broad term because basically the purpose of the grant is to spend money to provide services to students. As the grantee, you're kind of like the middleman, middle person, middle woman, in directing the grant funds to go out to pay for services that the students are choosing. What we don't want to happen is that the grantee use their grant funds to establish service providers. We don't want the grant funds to pay to set up a new company and get their business licenses and send all the future employees to the training that they need, et cetera, so that when it comes time for there to be, so that in the future, they'll be able to serve students or that they'll get better at serving students. The point is that whoever the service provider is needs to figure that stuff out, and then eventually, if they're the service provider, recoup those costs by providing the service, just like any business would. Like there are startup costs, and eventually you recoup those startup costs by making profit over time. That was sort of the thinking behind that requirement in the regulation. So basically the way that we want to see the money moving is that the money that goes to a service provider is paying for a service. It's not paying for the service provider to get better at doing their job, et cetera, even though obviously when the service provider gets paid, what they should be doing with that money is reinvesting it in their business and sending their folks to PD and all that sort of stuff. We just don't want to see a separate stream of money for that purpose.
Great. Okay, last 2 questions, the finale. So the first one is regarding contractual and indirect. So on that 25,000, how do they figure that out? If they don't know for sure yet what service providers they're going to be using, do they just do it on the total that they put in contractual? How would they do that?
Estimate now, revise later. So if you think you're going to have 2 service providers, and you think both of their contracts are going to be for more than $25,000, put in your budget, provider A, provider B, and then charge your indirect. You can, if you choose to, charge your indirect cost against the first 25,000 of each of those contracts, and then revise when you have changes.
And you'll notice if you are using the optional budget tool that it does have a little reminder. Anytime you click in that contractual area, you'll see a little pop-up that reminds you of that rule. And then our final question, so with that evaluator question, would the evaluation cost be part of the 5% direct administrative cap?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yes. So if they are doing an evaluation or using an evaluator, would those expenses be part of the 5% direct administrative cap?
I think we're going to have to get back to you on that one because that's it depends on what they're evaluating. I mean, that's a pretty specific question or fact specific question. So it should definitely be within the overall 20% of ACE project costs, but whether it is necessarily within the 5% direct admin is pretty specific. We'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, and there are a couple of, quite specific questions that we will be reaching out directly to you about those. So if you're wondering about your question, you fell in that category. And we are a good bit over, so we do want to wrap up as we know everyone has many other things, but we hope this information was helpful for you as you're preparing for that budget revision. Tomorrow morning, you'll receive the PDF of the slide deck of the examples that we showed and the actual Excel spreadsheet of the optional budget revision tool if you're going to be using that. If you have any other questions, remember you can reach out to Bianca. If you think you're one of those two that already have your budget magically in this format. And if you have questions specifically about the actual tool, about how to work it, you can always reach out to me at that oie@seiservices.com, or if you need, again, to be added to the invite list. So we'll pop up that survey one last time. So if you have not had an opportunity to click on it just yet and do your feedback survey, please do so. And then we will be seeing you soon, at least on November 12th, for our talking stick session, the first one of the new fiscal year. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.